I sentence you to death for the murder of Charles Humphreys.
Thank you. And probably see, I'll be up in heaven while y'all are rotting in hell. I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks Life Society for railroading my ass.
And I cannot go in the execution chamber and be executed under the devil. I have to come clean and cleanse my spirit in the name of Jesus Christ.
October 9, 2002, 9:47 a.m. Florida State Prison, Starke. She refused her last meal, only asked for black coffee, spent her final night laughing with a childhood friend. And when they strapped her to that gurney and asked for her final words, what she said left the entire execution chamber in stunned silence. But here's what they didn't tell you about Aileen Wuornos' last 24 hours. Before we unravel one of the most controversial executions in American history, I need to know something. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far Aileen's story has reached around the globe. United States? Europe? Asia? Anywhere else? Let me know below. Now back to October 9, 2002. By the way, I've hidden a little gift for you inside this video. If you love true crime and want to dig deeper than the headlines ever allow, keep watching. I'll tell you how to unlock it. Aileen Wuornos wasn't just another name on death row. She was America's most infamous female serial killer, convicted of taking the lives of 7 men along Florida's highways. But was she a cold-blooded predator who deserved to die? Or was she a shattered woman, broken by decades of unspeakable trauma, who the system failed long before she ever committed a single crime? The answer is far more complicated than you think, and it all comes down to those final 24 hours. To understand how Aileen Wuornos ended up on that execution gurney, we need to go back to where it all started. And I'm warning you now, this gets dark fast. February 29th, 1956. Rochester, Michigan. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on a leap year day, a date that only exists once every 4 years. Some might say that was the universe's first cruel joke on a child who would never catch a break. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted child predator. Aileen never knew him. He took his own life in prison when she was just 13 years old, hanging himself in his cell. But the damage he represented, the violence, the depravity, it was already embedded in her bloodline. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, wasn't much better. When Aileen was only 4 years old, Diane made a decision that would seal her daughter's fate. She abandoned both Aileen and her older brother Keith, leaving them behind like unwanted baggage. The children were handed over to their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. You'd think that would be the rescue, a second chance, a safe home. It wasn't. Lori Wuornos, Aileen's grandfather, was supposed to protect her. Instead, he became one of her worst nightmares. Aileen later revealed that he was physically violent and engaged in inappropriate contact with her. She wasn't safe in her own home. She wasn't safe anywhere. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen was already trading intimate favors with boys at school for cigarettes and spare change. Think about that for a second. 11 years old, a child who had been so deprived of love, safety, and basic human decency that she believed her only value was what her body could provide. At 14, everything got worse. Aileen became pregnant after being assaulted by a friend of her grandfather, a 14-year-old child, carrying a baby she never asked for in a home where no one cared. The baby was given up for adoption immediately after birth. Shortly after that, her grandmother Britta passed away, and instead of showing compassion to a grieving, traumatized teenage girl, Lori Wuornos threw Aileen out of the house. Just like that. 14 years old, no family, no money, no plan. She was homeless, alone, and the world didn't care. So what does a 14-year-old girl with no home, no support, and no options do survive? Aileen did what she had to. She hitchhiked along highways, slept in abandoned cars, and turned to the streets to make money. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. Her teenage years became a blur of arrests, assault, forgery, armed robbery, driving under the influence. She was caught in a system that punished her for trying to survive, but never once asked why a child was living this way in the first place. In 1976, at 20 years old, Aileen married a wealthy man named Louis Gratzfell. He was 69 years old, nearly 50 years her senior. For a brief moment, it seemed like her life might finally stabilize. Maybe this was her way out. It lasted 9 weeks. The marriage collapsed amid allegations of violence. Fell filed for a restraining order and an annulment. Once again, Aileen found herself with nothing. No husband, no home, no hope. The cycle continued: violence, instability, and a life lived on the very edge of society. By the late 1980s, Aileen was working the highways of Central Florida, particularly around Ocala and Daytona Beach. She survived by hitchhiking, picking up clients, and living out of cars and cheap motels. It was dangerous work. Every time she got into a stranger's vehicle, she was gambling with her life. But what choice did she have? Then, in 1986, something changed. Aileen walked into a gay bar and met a woman named Tyria Moore. They connected instantly. For the first time in Aileen's entire life, someone seemed to genuinely care about her. They began a romantic relationship, and Tyria became the one stable presence in Aileen's chaotic existence. But stability doesn't pay the bills. Aileen continued working the highways to support both of them. The relationship was strained by poverty, alcohol, and the constant danger of Aileen's lifestyle. Still, she kept going. She kept risking everything because for once, she had someone worth coming home to. And then, in late 1989, everything exploded. If you're still with me and this case is hitting differently than you expected, hit that like button right now. This story needs to be told, and your engagement helps me bring more untold cases to light. Trust me, what comes next will shock you. November 1989. A body was discovered in the woods off a Florida highway. Middle-aged white male, multiple gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber pistol. His car was missing. At first, investigators treated it as an isolated incident, a robbery gone wrong, maybe a drug deal. But then it happened again, and again, and again, over the course of 12 months, between November 1989 and November 1990. 7 men were found dead along Florida's highways. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. All victims were middle-aged white men. All had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. Their bodies were discovered in wooded areas off Interstate 75 and other remote roads in Central Florida. Their vehicles were either stolen or abandoned. Florida law enforcement knew they had a serial killer on their hands. But there was something unusual about this case, something that didn't fit the typical profile. The victims weren't chosen at random from neighborhoods or shopping centers. They were all found near highways. They were all men who had been driving alone, and the killers seemed to be targeting a very specific type of person. The question was, who was doing this, and why? The breakthrough came on January 9th, 1991. Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, on an outstanding warrant for a weapons violation. It seemed routine at first, just another arrest in a lifetime full of them. But investigators had been watching her. Witness descriptions, fingerprints lifted from abandoned vehicles, and physical evidence were starting to point in one direction. Within days of her arrest, they connected Aileen to the murders. And then they made their move on Tyria Moore. Remember Tyria? The woman Aileen loved. The one person she thought would stand by her no matter what. Investigators approached Tyria and offered her a deal. Cooperate with us, and you walk away free. Refuse, and you could be charged as an accomplice. Tyria didn't hesitate. She agreed to help. Police set up recorded phone calls between Tyria and Aileen while Aileen was in custody. In those conversations, you can hear the desperation in Aileen's voice. She confessed to the killings, but she begged Tyria not to worry. She promised to take full responsibility. She told Tyria she would protect her, that everything would be okay. Tyria said all the right things. She told Aileen she loved her. She told her to stay strong. And then she handed those recordings straight to the police. When Aileen finally spoke to investigators, her story was consistent. She claimed that all 7 men had either assaulted her or attempted to assault her while she was working. According to Aileen, every single incident was self-defense. These men picked her up, became violent, and she fought back the only way she knew how. But here's where this case gets complicated, and where the justice system may have failed her. Her first victim was a man named Richard Mallory. He was found in December 1989, shot multiple times. Aileen insisted that Mallory had violently attacked her and that she killed him to save her own life. What the jury never heard during her trial was this. Richard Mallory had a prior conviction for violent assault. He had spent time in prison for it. This wasn't some innocent man who happened to pick up the wrong person. This was a man with a documented history of violence against women. But Aileen's defense team never introduced that evidence. The jury never knew. And because of that, they saw Richard Mallory as just another victim, not as someone who fit the exact pattern Aileen described. Would have changed the outcome? We'll never know. But it raises a massive question about whether Aileen Wuornos ever truly received a fair trial. Aileen's trial for the taking of Richard Mallory's life began in January 1992 in Volusia County, Florida. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer who lured men to their end, robbed them, and left their bodies to rot in the woods. They argued she wasn't defending herself. She was hunting. The defense tried to argue trauma, abuse, and self-defense. But without that crucial evidence about Mallory's violent past, their case fell apart. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. 2 hours to decide whether a woman should live or die. They returned with a guilty verdict. Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death. Over the following months, she pleaded guilty or no contest to 5 additional cases. 5 more death sentences. She never went to trial for the 7th victim. In total, 6 death sentences were handed down. The state of Florida made it clear Aileen Wuornos would not leave prison alive. She was transferred to Broward Correctional Institution in Pembroke Pines, Florida, where she would spend the next decade on death row. Her legal team filed appeal after appeal, arguing ineffective counsel, mental incompetence, and the failure to present evidence of her horrific past. For years, it seemed like those appeals might work. That maybe, just maybe, someone would look closer at this broken woman's life and see that the system had failed her long before she ever harmed anyone. But then, in 2001, everything changed. In early 2001, Aileen Wuornos did something that stunned her legal team, advocacy groups, and anyone following her case. She fired her attorneys. All of them. She announced that she was done fighting, done appealing, done trying to prove she deserved to live. She told the court she wanted to waive all remaining appeals and demanded that her execution be carried out as soon as possible. Her reasoning? Chilling. In interviews, Aileen stated bluntly that if she were ever released from prison, she would harm again. She said she couldn't stop herself, that the rage inside her was too deep, too permanent. She claimed that spending the rest of her life locked in a cage was worse than ending it all, and she preferred the latter. To many, this sounded like a confession of guilt, an acknowledgement that she was exactly what the prosecution said she was, a remorseless killer. But to others, especially mental health advocates, this sounded like something far more disturbing. This sounded like a woman whose mind was unraveling. British documentary filmmaker Nick Broomfield had been following Aileen's story for years. In 2001, he was granted permission to interview her on death row. What he captured on camera was deeply unsettling. Aileen appeared paranoid, agitated, and detached from reality. She claimed that prison officials were torturing her using sonic pressure and remote control techniques. She said they were beaming sounds into her cell to drive her insane. She talked about voices that wouldn't stop, voices that controlled her thoughts. She rambled about conspiracies, about being monitored, about forces beyond her control manipulating her mind. At times, she seemed lucid. At other times, she seemed completely lost in delusions. This is where it gets controversial. Do you think someone showing clear signs of mental decline should be allowed to weigh their appeals? Comment yes or no. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this. Mental health experts who reviewed the footage were alarmed. Anti-death penalty activists argued that Aileen was clearly suffering from severe mental illness and should not be executed. They pointed to decades of untreated trauma, possible psychosis, and a mind that had been shattered by a lifetime of horrors. But the state saw it differently. The court ordered psychiatric evaluations to determine whether Aileen was mentally competent to weigh her appeals. Court-appointed psychiatrists examined her extensively. Their conclusion? Despite her apparent delusions, paranoia, and declining mental state, Aileen Wuornos understood the legal proceedings against her. She understood that waiving her appeals meant she would be executed. She understood the consequences. Therefore, according to Florida law, she was competent to make that decision. Mental health advocates were outraged. How could someone who believed prison guards were using sonic weapons on her be considered competent? How could someone hearing voices and displaying clear signs of psychosis be trusted to make a rational decision about her own life? But the courts had made their ruling. Aileen was competent. Her request to end all appeals was granted. Florida Governor Jeb Bush had the power to intervene. He could have granted clemency. He could have delayed the execution pending further evaluation. He could have commuted her sentence to life in prison without parole. He did nothing. On October 1st, 2002, the final execution date was set. October 9, 2002. Aileen Wuornos had 8 days left to live. And in those final days, her behavior would be even stranger than anyone expected. The debate surrounding Aileen's competency didn't end with the court's decision. Lawyers, psychologists, and human rights organizations continued to raise alarms. They argued that the state was essentially allowing someone to volunteer for their own execution while in the grip of mental illness. Some called it state-assisted self-harm. Others called it justice finally being served. The victims' families had waited over a decade for closure. They wanted the sentence carried out. They deserved peace. But at what cost? As October 9th approached, Aileen seemed almost at peace with her fate. She stopped fighting. She stopped arguing. She made arrangements for her final hours. Who she would see, what she would say, and how she wanted to be remembered. The countdown had begun. October 8th, 2002. Aileen Wuornos had less than 24 hours to live. That evening, she received her final visitor, Dawn Botkins, a childhood friend from Michigan. Dawn was one of the few people who had stayed in Aileen's life throughout the years, writing letters, accepting collect calls, never abandoning her even when the rest of the world had. Aileen had declined visits from almost everyone else. She refused to see Arlene Prawl, the born-again Christian woman who had legally adopted her back in 1991. Despite being only 1 year older than Aileen, she refused her former attorneys. She refused spiritual advisors. She didn't want prayers. She didn't want last-minute legal arguments. She didn't want anyone trying to save her soul or convince her to keep fighting. She only wanted Dawn. What happened during that visit surprised everyone who witnessed it. Aileen wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She wasn't having a breakdown. Instead, according to prison staff who observed the visit, Aileen was upbeat, almost cheerful. She laughed frequently. She joked with Dawn. She reminisced about their childhood in Michigan, about simpler times before everything went wrong. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbyes, no final confessions or apologies. It was as if Aileen had made complete peace with what was coming. Or perhaps, as some believed, she had given up on life so long ago that this execution was simply the formality that made it official. After Dawn left, the protocols began. Aileen was transferred from her regular death row cell to a holding cell located near the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Starke. This was standard procedure for condemned inmates in their final hours, keeping them close, minimizing movement, and ensuring nothing could go wrong. Prison guards who monitored her throughout that final night reported something unusual. Aileen remained calm and talkative. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't panicking. She engaged in casual conversation with the guards, asking mundane questions, making small talk as if this were just another ordinary night. She didn't sleep much. How could she? But she also didn't seem restless or afraid. There was an odd tranquility about her. A woman who had spent her entire life running, fighting, and surviving, now perfectly still. She didn't request to see a chaplain. She didn't ask for a Bible. She didn't write any final letters to loved ones or enemies. No last words for Tyria Moore, the woman who had betrayed her. No message for the families of the men whose lives she had taken. Nothing. It was as if Aileen had already said everything she needed to say, or perhaps she had nothing left worth saying. In Florida, death row inmates were traditionally offered a final meal, a last request costing up to $20, prepared from ingredients available at the prison. It's a ritual that dates back centuries, a final gesture of humanity before the state takes a life. Some inmates requested elaborate spreads, T-bone steaks, lobster tails, heaps of fried chicken, multiple desserts, and comfort foods that reminded them of home and happier times. For many, that last meal was a final connection to the world they were about to leave behind. Aileen Wuornos wanted none of it. When prison officials asked her what she wanted for her final meal, she declined. No steak, no dessert, no comfort food, nothing. She wasn't interested in a final indulgence or symbolic gesture. She had no appetite for rituals. On the morning of October 9, 2002, as dawn broke over Florida State Prison and her final hours tick away, Aileen accepted only one thing: a single cup of black coffee. That's it, black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just bitter, dark, and simple, much like the life she had lived. It was the last thing Aileen Wuornos would ever taste. As dawn broke on October 9th, 2002, the final preparations began. Outside Florida State Prison in Starke, protesters had gathered on both sides of the debate. Some held signs calling for an end to the death penalty, their voices rising in chants and prayers. Others stood silently, representing the families of the 7 men whose lives had been taken, families who had waited over a decade for this moment. Media crews set up cameras. Reporters prepared their live broadcasts. The families of Aileen's victims were notified. Witnesses, including journalists, prison officials, and legal observers, were escorted into the viewing area adjacent to the execution chamber. At approximately 9:30 a.m., Aileen was led into the execution chamber. She was strapped to a gurney, arms extended. Intravenous lines were inserted into her veins. Florida's lethal injection protocol used a 3-drug combination designed to induce unconsciousness, paralyze the body, and stop the heart. Before the drugs were administered, Aileen was given the opportunity to make a final statement. The room fell silent. Witnesses leaned forward. Some expected an apology. Others anticipated confession, or perhaps a final plea for forgiveness. Maybe she would express remorse for the lives she had taken. Instead, Aileen Wuornos looked up and said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." The words hung in the air, bizarre, cryptic, unsettling. No one knew what to make of those words. Some interpreted them as a reference to the 1996 science fiction film Independence Day, where alien invaders arrive on Earth in massive spaceships. Others saw fragmented religious imagery mixed with pop culture, Jesus, a mothership, a promise to return. Many simply found them disturbing, a final glimpse into a mind that seemed fractured beyond repair. Was this mental illness speaking? Delusion? Or was it Eileen's last act of defiance? Leaving everyone confused, uncomfortable, and unable to neatly categorize her final moments? We'll never know. The warden gave the signal. The first drug flowed through the IV lines, sodium pentothal, designed to render her unconscious. Eileen's eyes began to close. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, paralyzed her muscles, stopping her breathing. The third drug, potassium chloride, stopped her heart. Within minutes, it was over. At 9:47 a.m. on October 9th, 2002, Aileen Carol Wuornos was pronounced gone. The witnesses filed out in silence. Outside, protesters dispersed. The media packed up their equipment. The victims' families finally had the closure they'd been waiting for. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt only emptiness. Eileen's body was removed from the execution chamber and taken to be cremated according to her wishes. Dawn Botkins, her loyal childhood friend, would later take her ashes back to Michigan and scatter some of them beneath a tree, fulfilling Eileen's final wish to return home. After Eileen's execution, her body was cremated according to her final wishes. Dawn Botkins, the childhood friend who had stood by her until the very end, took responsibility for her ashes. Dawn traveled back to Michigan, the place where Eileen's tragic story had begun 46 years earlier, and scattered some of her ashes beneath a tree. It was Eileen's final wish, to return home, to the only place she had ever known before the world destroyed her. But Eileen's story didn't end with her passing. In fact, it was only beginning to reach a wider audience. In 2003, just 1 year after her execution, the film Monster was released. Charlize Theron portrayed Aileen in a performance that would earn her an Academy Award for Best Actress. The film didn't glorify Aileen or excuse her actions. Instead, it humanized her. It showed audiences the abused child, the abandoned teenager, the desperate woman trying to survive in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. For the first time, millions of people saw Aileen Wuornos not as a monster, but as a human being shaped by unimaginable trauma. The film sparked intense debates about justice, mental health, abuse, and whether society bears any responsibility for creating the killers it later condemns. Since then, Aileen Wuornos has remained a subject of intense fascination. Documentaries have dissected every detail of her life and crimes. Books have analyzed her psychology. Podcasts have debated her guilt, her sanity, and her treatment by the justice system. True crime communities continue to argue about her case with the same passion as they did 2 decades ago. Because here's the thing. Eileen's story forces us to confront questions that have no comfortable answers. Was she a cold-blooded predator who targeted vulnerable men, robbed them, and left them to die in the woods? Or was she a victim herself, a woman who had been violated, traumatized, and pushed to the absolute edge until something inside her snapped? Were her claims of self-defense legitimate? Did those men really attack her? Or were they convenient lies to justify taking what she wanted? Should a woman showing clear signs of severe mental illness, paranoia, delusions, hearing voices, have been allowed to waive her appeals and volunteer for execution? Was that justice, Or was that the state taking advantage of a broken mind? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, did society fail Aileen Wuornos long before she ever harmed anyone? When she was being violated as a child, where were the protections? When she was thrown onto the streets at 14, where was the support? When she was surviving through dangerous work, where were the alternatives? Aileen Wuornos occupies a unique and controversial place in true crime history. She's one of the very few female serial killers in American history, and her case continues to challenge our understanding of violence, gender, and justice. Male serial killers are often studied through the lens of psychology and pathology. We examine their childhoods, their traumas, their mental states. But when a woman becomes a serial killer, society struggles to process it. We're conditioned to see women as nurturers, caregivers, victims, not predators. Aileen forced the world to reckon with the fact that women, too, are capable of extreme violence when pushed far enough. Her legacy isn't simple. To the families of her 7 victims, she will always be the woman who took their loved ones away. Fathers, brothers, sons who never came home. Their pain is real. Their grief is valid, and no amount of trauma in Aileen's past erases what she did to them. But to others, Aileen represents something bigger, a failure of systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. She was failed as a child, failed as a teenager, failed as an adult, and ultimately, failed by a justice system that executed her while she was clearly mentally unwell. The uncomfortable truth is this: there are no easy answers. Aileen Wuornos was both a victim and a perpetrator. She suffered unimaginable horrors, and she inflicted unimaginable horrors on others. Both things can be true at the same time, and that's what makes her story so haunting. It doesn't fit into neat categories of good and evil, guilty and innocent, monster and victim. It's complicated, it's messy, and it stays with you. So where does that leave us? The story of Aileen Wuornos is a tragedy on every single side. 7 men lost their lives along Florida's highways. 7 families were shattered, left to grieve fathers, brothers, and sons who never came home. Their pain doesn't disappear because Aileen had a difficult past. Their loss is permanent, and they deserve justice. But Aileen's life was a tragedy too. A child born into violence, abandoned, violated, and thrown away by everyone who was supposed to protect her. She never had a chance. From the moment she entered this world, the deck was stacked against her. And then there's a justice system, a system that convicted her, sentenced her to death, and ultimately executed her while she was clearly struggling with severe mental illness. Was that justice? Or was it simply the easiest way to close the case and move on? The truth is, everyone involved in this story lost something. The victims lost their lives. Their families lost their loved ones. Aileen lost her humanity long before the state took her life. And society, we lost the opportunity to ask harder questions about how we treat our most vulnerable. What does Aileen Wuornos' story teach us? It teaches us that trauma doesn't excuse violence, but it does explain it. It teaches us that the line between victim and perpetrator is often blurrier than we want to admit. It teaches us that mental health matters, that childhood matters, and that when we fail people early in life, the consequences can be catastrophic for everyone. On October 9th, 2002, all that remained of Aileen Carol Wuornos was a cup of black coffee and a handful of cryptic words about motherships and returning. A life that began in violence ended the exact same way, strapped to a gurney, with the state administering the final blow. This case stays with you long after the story ends. If you made it this far, you're part of the Not community that believes these stories matter. Subscribe so you never miss when we untangle the next case. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Was justice served, or did the system fail everyone involved? And if this video made you think differently about true crime, share it with someone who needs to hear this story. I'll see you in the next untangling. Oh, and that GIF I mentioned? It's a free digital case file I put together just for you, packed with details you won't find in the video. You can grab it instantly through the link in the description or pinned in the comments.